23% of 17-year-old boys in America now have an ADHD diagnosis. 23%, according to the New York Times. ADHD, of course, has been around long before there was even a label ADHD. Ritalin and Adderall, the medications, have been game changers for millions of boys and girls. Adults are now commonly diagnosed with the disorder. It is all over social media if you look. But a growing number of parents and some experts are questioning, has the net been cast too wide? Is the proliferation we're seeing purely medical, or could other factors maybe be at play? Stephen P. Hinshaw is Distinguished Professor of Psychology at UC-Berkeley. He was department chair from 2004 to 2011. He now runs the Hinshaw Lab. He has written numerous articles in this field and books like The ADHD Explosion, Myths, Medication, Money, and Today's Push for Performance. I had about 100 questions for him about this, and I think we got to all of them. Dr. Hinshaw is a true expert on ADHD. Steve Hinshaw, welcome to All Boy.
Thanks so much for having me on.
ADHD is so widely discussed, so widely diagnosed. And, some people at this point are thinking, is this an omni-diagnosis? Were we just not detecting it before? Could you just clearly state for us what is ADHD and what is not ADHD?
Like almost everything else in the world of neurodevelopment and mental health, mental illness, what we today call ADHD exists on a spectrum. When I was in grad school, we learned you had autism or you didn't. Now they're called the autism spectrum disorders. You clearly had bipolar disorder or you were of normal mood, but now we call them the bipolar spectrum of disorders.
I didn't know that.
ADHD is exactly the same. Very few of us are perfectly focused all the time. Very few of us are free from distraction. And it really forms a bell curve in terms of the two fundamental dimensions of inattentiveness, disorganization, distractibility on the one hand, and impulsive and overly active behaviors on the other. So, just as with blood pressure, when do you have hypertension and when are you normotensive? Well, it's a decision as to where to draw the line in a smooth bell curve. Now, when you're way above that line, if you go into your doctor and your blood pressure's 300 over 200, you better get medical intervention right away because you don't have long to live. You'll have a stroke.
Right.
But what if you're 135 over 88? Well, that used to be called borderline hypertension. Now it's considered hypertension because it's, again, somewhat arbitrary, but the risk really goes up the further above the norm you go. And the same is true for ADHD. ADHD is the latest name in something that originated, not surprisingly, at the time that compulsory education took over Europe and the United States. So, here's a kind of interesting metaphor, I think. We know that severe alcoholism, substance use disorders, have a fairly strong genetic basis. They don't exist unless you're in a culture where there's alcohol, right?
Mm-hmm.
You could have that genetic vulnerability, but if there's no alcohol in the culture, you never develop alcoholism. What's the alcohol for ADHD? Compulsory education. If you don't have to go to school and sit still the way human children didn't unless you were a child of the royalty for millennia, you wouldn't be diagnosed with ADHD. Now, that doesn't mean it's not real. In today's achievement-oriented world, it's really important that you get a good start, and academic performance really helps you socially, economically, self-esteem-wise later on. But again, it's what the extremes are. At the extreme of distractibility, at the extreme of not being organized, you're going to have trouble probably even in a hunter-gatherer society where there's no compulsory education, right?
But Steve, when I hear the word extreme, 23% of 17-year-old boys in America having the diagnosis, there are more people who are really intensely focused on, I don't know, any number of things out there, and they're not diagnosed with a disorder. It doesn't seem,
right.
That number doesn't seem to add up with extreme.
So you were reading my mind. So where's the extreme? Well, as with depression and as with hypertension, it depends on what the consequences are. So, we know that around the world, if you live in a society that has compulsory education and is not a subsistence culture where there are bigger problems than paying attention in school, the prevalence of ADHD in people under 18 is a remarkably consistent 5 to 7%. So it makes you think, and we'll talk about this in a few minutes, I'm sure, but if there's a genetic liability, and it's not one single gene, but there's a number of genes that when inherited together makes it more difficult for you to overcome distractibility and to really reason with yourself before you do an action. And then you're met with having to sit still from a very young age. It's a remarkably consistent percentage. However, the U.S. and Israel are way above the world average. And I don't believe that's because there are genetic differences in major ways between U.S. and Israel and the rest of the world.
Why do you think it is?
It has to be something about the push for performance. It has to be something about this exclusive focus on test scores. And it's hard to diagnose ADHD well. But most kids get diagnosed with ADHD in a pediatrician's office where the pediatrician doesn't have specialty experience. Most adults today who get diagnosed, are diagnosed in a general practitioner's office who has no specialty training, with the average amount of time yielded for a diagnosis is about 12 to 15 minutes. This
Really?
takes several hours of hard work to do well. Otherwise, what do we get, especially for boys? Overdiagnosis. Boys are slower to develop language. Boys' brain development is slower for the first few years of life than girls, by a lot. And so what we've witnessed is in exclusively high-performance societies and with substandard diagnostic processes where a simple checklist, or not even a checklist, just a parent report that everybody says Louis isn't behaving very well, the doctor has a quick diagnosis of ADHD to make and one piece of weaponry in their armamentarium, which is a prescription pad. Not family therapy, not behavior modification, et cetera, et cetera. And so we're in a kind of perfect storm of overdiagnosis, especially for boys.
And you're not an ADHD denier. I mean, you very much take this seriously. You think it should be tackled in a real way, which we'll get into. But if I can summarize what I'm hearing you say is, Michael Thompson was on with us, a clinical psychologist who works with boys, and he said, suddenly you saw this shoot up when No Child Left Behind came into effect. You had parents who wanted their children to achieve. You had recess time going down. You had teachers who had rambunctious kids. You have boys who by their nature are a little wilder. Usually my sons are less linguistic, than maybe their female counterparts on average. And then the diagnostic part, you have companies which sell medications in America. But also, like I have read that in the DSM, the manual you use to diagnose a mental disorder, this is supposed to be a secondary diagnosis, that if the symptoms could be attributed to something else, that should go first. But it always seems to be ADHD is going first.
So this is the case for boys. It has not been until very recently the case for girls, because we knew it had to be, it was all anxiety or depression, and we didn't really understand that girls could and do have ADHD. So this is why assessment is so crucial. If you're traumatized early in life, you're inattentive, you're distractible, you're spacey, you may dissociate, can look a lot like ADHD. If you have what are called petit mal or minor motor seizures, during those absence periods, you look like you have inattentive ADHD. And I could go on, the list goes on. Low birth weight is a big contributor to ADHD, especially among kids of poverty. The only problem with the DSM is its title, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. What's a disorder? It's a syndrome. It's symptoms and signs that go together, subjective reports and objective tests, and these things go together, with a unifying cause. Depression's not a disorder. There's many pathways to major depression. Same for bipolar disorder. Same for autism. Clearly the same for ADHD. ADHD has a very strong genetic liability. Again, what point on the curve are you? About 40% of biological parents of kids with ADHD have ADHD symptoms galore themselves, whether they've been diagnosed or not. But there are other causal pathways. Severe neglect can be one. It takes some time to rule out what the other plausible conditions might be. You can't do it on a quick parental report, and 10 or 15 minutes later the prescription pad gets lauded out, because that's the only, again, piece of intervention that most doctors know how to use. So what we've had for some time now is a kind of underdiagnosis crisis for girls who were never thought to have ADHD, and an overdiagnosis crisis for boys. And the hope is that with the science and the accurate science coming out, and with really upholding the standards, there's good standards out there for how to diagnose ADHD, but you don't get good insurance reimbursement for doing it, and the more patients you can kind of roll through your practice in a day, this is, I think, one of the underlying causes of this explosion.
Can I ask you about the diagnosis also? Is it how far you deviate from the average, or is it how disruptive it is to your life and your classroom?
So the answer is C, both of the above.
Okay.
Right? You know, and I know people who are not terribly focused, and they're probably pretty creative, and they're out of the box thinking maybe when they should be a little more inside the box, but they're successful, they're smart, and they've had good chances, they're in the right job. We don't diagnose any disorder, which again is really a syndrome in the DSM, unless there's what we call impairment. The symptoms are one thing, but if they're really triggering failure in school, or with boys and girls, triggering no kids really want to play with you. You're the one who blows out the birthday candles, but it wasn't your birthday party. It was your friend's birthday, right? I mean, these are the things that land kids in trouble, and for adults, sending that nasty email to the boss the first week the new boss is in place, and you probably shouldn't have done that, all the way to serious accidents, all the way to cutting behavior, non-suicidal, self-injury, and suicide, and pretty high risk for substance abuse for many people with ADHD. It's the consequences, the impairments, that really yield the diagnosis.
On boys specifically, I think 10 to 14-year-old boys are the lion's share of prescriptions and stimulant recipients.
Right.
What is the effect of having millions upon millions of boys on this? Is it a net good? You know, is it kind of like, well, yeah, maybe we're medicating some who didn't need it, but net, it's a positive, or what do you think?
This is a big philosophical and medical and ethical question. So for a long time, many people had problems with high LDL, the bad cholesterol, if you will. And now we have statins, and millions of people take statins. And for most people, you take a statin, and within a week or two, your LDL is back in the normal range, and there's very few side effects. Of course, there can be side effects with any medication or any form of treatment. And it's kind of accepted that this may be a helpful public health means. But when we're talking about a medication like a stimulant, a selective dopamine reuptake inhibitor, which we'll talk more about in detail very soon, well, that's mind control. And you don't medicate symptoms of being inattentive or doing poorly in school. It's all about personal effort and will. So there's a dissociation between how we think about so-called physical disorders and how we think about so-called mental disorders. Mm-hmm. We shouldn't really be medicating for behavior control. Well, what about bipolar disorder? People with serious bipolar disorder, about 2 to 3% of the population, if untreated, 45% of those people will try to end their lives. Yeah. And about half of that number will succeed in ending their lives. And medication is a lifesaver. For ADHD, it's really about severity and impairment. All of us are a bit inattentive at times. That's just the way human beings are. But not all of us need stimulant medications. In fact, a lot of college students who don't have ADHD take medications to stay up all night to prepare for the midterm or get the term paper done, etc.
I heard.
Thinking that it's really helping their learning, and it's not. For neurotypical people, stimulants keep you awake longer and alert longer, but they don't really help your learning. If you have ADHD, you're beyond that certain point, they really do facilitate some big aspects of learning, but they only bring you halfway to the norm. You need educational interventions. You need parent management. You need school consultation. So, number one, medication in the U.S., if you're above 5, is thought as the primary treatment. In most of the rest of the world, medication is thought of if the educational and behavioral and family and school interventions don't work, then you bring it in. So it's another reason why there's a lot of diagnosis and treatment in our country.
Is it just because it's too expensive? I mean, why not? Because we don't have the resources, or what? Because I don't know any parent who would say, I'm sure there's some outlier who would say, yeah, I want to put my child on unnecessary medication.
That's right. You don't. It's the lowest dose possible. Only use it if you need it. But again, it's a public health issue. When do you need ADHD medication? If you're a little bit distractible at work, if you're argumentative and interrupting a bit of the time, well, there's self-control treatments that can really help with that. But if your life is at risk, and if the risk of accidental injury or having no friends is in play, the good thing about ADHD medications is that they take effect if they work within a matter of 1 or 2 or 3 days. You can do a trial if you've got a doctor in the know and see what the right medicine is, the right dose is, and a couple weeks later you know, and it's not like yes or no. With most medications, it takes months to even know if they're working or not.
Right.
So what I tell a lot of families is, where the ADHD symptoms are pretty severe and the consequences are real, talk with your doctor about doing a trial and see if it works. But most of the time, not only are the diagnoses quick, but the medication is prescribed, and the doctor might say, well, call me in 6 months. That's way too long. You have to evaluate daily, weekly to see where the symptoms are, where the impairments are, and if medication is even worth using.
Speaking of evaluation, you wrote in the annual review of clinical psychology this analysis, which you actually wrote in English so we could all read it, and I appreciate that we could actually understand it.
It was good in Pig Latin before, but English is better.
It's called ADHD Controversy, Developmental Mechanisms and Multiple Levels of Analysis. And, you know, you look at some of the factors here. Let me just read a few real quick. The CDC notes that 78% of ADHD kids also have a second diagnosis. Right. It could be conduct disorder, it could be anxiety, depression, autism. You talked about that. And you actually wrote something in the paper that I just wanted to read the quote. ADHD far transcends its stereotypic presentation as problems of fidgeting and distractibility in middle-class elementary school-aged boys who are parented permissively and who contend with stifling classrooms. And you talk about something like the genetic factor. I did not realize ADHD is more heritable than something like depression. You say it's more on par with like schizophrenia, bipolar, things like that.
And autism, right, yeah. Yeah, it's amazing. It defies the stereotype because we all think it's lousy parenting or lousy classrooms.
Or someone who wants extra time on a test.
Right.
You know, somebody is of a privileged upbringing and they get an extra 10% or 50% on their test time and they want to blow it out of the water. Well, then let me ask you that. Has a biomarker been found? Because you talked about some of the risk factors, low birth weight, prenatal toxins, alcohol, maybe nicotine, lead paint exposure. Is there a biomarker?
As in most of mental health, child and adult, there's no single biomarker.
Okay.
We know from brain imaging studies there are certain brain pathways that seem to be somewhat compromised in people with ADHD. But it's not specific enough to scan my brain or your brain and say, well, you've got it, and Chase, and I don't, Steve, right? It's the research is progressing. It's a constellation of, and let's just speak to this truthfully, it's a constellation of problems: inattention, distractibility, and hyperactivity and impulsivity that are quite extreme, but it's misnamed. Most people with ADHD can pay really good attention if they're into it, if it's intrinsically motivating. In fact, one of the symptoms is hyperfocus. You forget lunch and you forget dinner because you're so into your video game or the thing you love to do. So what we really know from a lot of research is ADHD isn't an attention deficit disorder, it's a regulatory disorder. How do you know when it's time to eat? How do you know that now I can really buckle down because schoolwork doesn't come as easily to me, and then use as a reward the time that I'm really into something? So when you start to think about it that way, ADHD symptoms don't go away when you hit puberty, which is what psychiatry thought for about 100 years. They persist in more subtle form into adulthood. And so you may not be running around a classroom or running around the office where you work, but the distractibility and the interrupting of others and the problem regulating where you focus and when and how can actually become more severe later in life, even though the most salient symptoms may have gone underground.
So you're saying there's definitely a biological aspect to this, but then some of those things like regulatory behavior, some of those seems like they could be life skills that could be taught. And in fact, you do say in here that adoption studies have found that socialization and things in homes also matter.
That's right. Even when you don't have this biological relatedness between parent and child, the way you do in biological families, it's somewhat of a paradox, but it's not if you think about it. For kids with a neurodevelopmental syndrome like ADHD, it appears early in life, and it's going to predict a lot of problems later on. And it's over 80% heritables, the fancy term. The genes that differ between people explain more of ADHD by far than the environments that differ between people. Well, then parents are just shepherds. You can't really do much, and teachers just have to tolerate. Wrong. It's in fact for kids with ADHD that parenting really matters more than for neurotypical kids. And where a flexible school environment, where there's clear expectations to learn, but some of the day you can be standing, and some of the days in group projects, and you don't have to sit in the one-room schoolhouse with your hands folded all day. So the mistake is, well, we've made a couple of mistakes over time. ADHD is a character flaw, it's laziness, you're just not trying, to, oh, look at the genes in twin and family studies. They play a big role, and they do. Therefore, parents and schools are not important. That's totally wrong as well. It's the combination of the genetic vulnerability one has with the environment that predicts the outcome. It's just like that alcohol example. If you never have alcohol in your environment, but you've got a strong genetic loading for alcoholism, you don't develop the condition.
What about between groups? Because black and white children, according to the CDC, 12% of them are diagnosed. Asian American kids, 4%.
Yeah.
I mean, there's not a meaningful difference genetically between these groups that would, I think, yield such a disparate, diagnostic
well, even
rate.
From what you've said, that's a big change, because everybody knew 30 years ago ADHD was in boys. It was the Tom Sawyer syndrome, the middle-class boy who didn't want to paint the picket fence and got bored in school by Tuesday afternoon. And now, except for Asian American kids who are lower because of culture and cultural bias, I think predominantly, ADHD is an equal opportunity condition. We used to think that anorexia nervosa only existed in upper middle class white girls with perfectionistic parents. Wrong. It does exist more in girls than boys, but it's across races and ethnicities and religions. And the same is true for depression, bipolar disorder, ADHD. Interestingly, though, poorer families are at higher risk for just about all those disorders. And because that's where the concentrations of early toxins are. And that's where there's less consistent parenting. So it's not biology or environment, it's how they come together.
What about the boy versus girl? Because you're actually an expert on girls who have ADHD, but, boys and girls, you look at the risk factors. Again, birth weight, prenatal toxin, lead exposure. Low-income families, at-risk families, 50-50 boys and girls, yet boys are 2 times more likely to have ADHD.
So this is, I think, real. When I was in grad school, back in the dark ages, we thought it was 10 to 1. And we thought autism was 10 or 15 to 1. We now know a couple of things. Number one, boys come out of the chute into life with the reason they're boys is the XY configuration, the Y, a little skimpy Y chromosome with only about 50 genes on it, tells the embryo and fetus in prenatal development to secrete androgen and other testosterone. So that much makes you a biological male. On the other hand, it slows your brain development. Go to any preschool. Look at the 2.5 and 3-year-old girls. They're talking in circles and talking about world politics and interpersonal, and occasional marauding boy grunts and ruins their social interactions. Yep. So boys are slower to develop empathy. They're slower linguistically. They care what other people think more about them. They're more compliant. So it's little wonder that in the real world, it's about 3 to 1 boys to girls with autism. Mm-hmm. It's about 2.3 to 1 boys to girls with ADHD. It's about 4 to 1 for Tourette, a motor disorder. This also neurodevelopmental. For very severe early aggression, it's about 7 to 1. So boys are more vulnerable in the first 10 years of life to slower development, if you will, mentally, cognitively, emotionally. Little wonder that they have a predominant. But it's not what we thought. Again, when I was even in training, it's not 10 to 1 or 15 or 20 to 1. But boys are going to be also more likely to have the form of ADHD marked by more disruption and hyperactivity. They're more of a pain in the neck to classmates and the teacher, which is another reason that they've been overrepresented in a lot of diagnoses.
I see, because I did read one strain is being inattentive, the other one is being hyperactive or impulsive.
Right, and both can come together. It's what we call the combined form of ADHD.
Okay.
But girls are more likely than boys, excuse me, to have this exclusively inattentive form, which you're suffering in silence. You're not disrupting the room, but you're not learning very well. And the teacher can basically pay her attention to the more disruptive kids, the boys, and leave you suffering in silence.
I see. Okay, so then what to do about it? And we've been talking about some of the treatments. If we could start with pharmacological and then maybe end with behavioral.
Right.
Adderall seems to be the number one medicine now. Ritalin isn't so popular anymore, right?
Well, it depends on the region and depends on your health care and it depends on the medication shortages we have. So both Ritalin, which is the trade name for methylphenidate, and Adderall, trade name for mixed amphetamine salts, are SDRIs. They're selective dopamine reuptake inhibitors. What? Well, everybody knows what an SSRI is, a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. It leaves serotonin in the gap between neurons, the synapse, a little bit longer, helps regulate serotonin flow. The stimulant medications, it's a bad word, they don't really stimulate, they stimulate the parts of the brain that help you develop regulation, keep dopamine in the synaptic cleft a few milliseconds longer, which helps regulate dopamine flow on down the chains in the trillions of synapses we have in each of our brains. For neurotypical people, again, if you need to pull that all-nighter, one of the side effects of stimulants is it keeps you up longer. There used to be diet pills. They're not very safe for that. But they also stimulate, if you will, the part of the brain, other dopamine centers and pathways that mimic reward and that feeling of pleasure falsely. So they have a big addictive potential. If you have ADHD and you're prescribed a stimulant medication, and again, the more severe the ADHD, the more likely this is, you don't get, and especially as a child, you don't get any euphoria, you don't get any urge to take more. It actually makes you a little bit more focused and a little bit sadder in the sense of being more focused rather than giddy. And we know that compared to the other treatments we have for ADHD, if you want to get that kid less impulsive and paying more attention, stimulants really do work for about 80% of kids if you get the right dose. Do they cure the kid? No. If you have severe diabetes and you take insulin, what happens the day you stop? The symptoms reappear. Right. The same is true for these medications. And we also know, through studies I've done and many of my colleagues have done, that if you want to help not only reduce the symptoms into a more normative range, but increase academic skills and social skills and help parents really parent more consistently and warmly and with real limits, and help with, again, reading and math tests, not just your classroom behavior. It's combining the lowest possible dose of stimulants with parent management training, school consultation, and as you get older, cognitive behavioral therapy, anger management, time management, organizational skills. That's what gets kids more competencies and closer to the normal range of functioning.
Wow. Which, again, you talk about wraparound services or a more holistic approach, and it sounds so great in theory. It also requires a lot out of parents and educational resources.
And our healthcare system, which isn't very systematic, and it's biased to people with better health coverage, et cetera, et cetera. And America has been, because of pharma, in large part, 30 years ago, 90% of the world's ADHD medications were distributed to Americans, which, a fraction of the population. And now the rest of the world is catching up, but the rest of the world isn't as likely to have medications written the first day in that 10, 15-minute assessment. They're going to try other things first and then see if the medications will help.
I did not realize the dopamine facet of this treatment, but when people say, I think I remember a Netflix documentary about it like 5 years ago, they say this is very similar to meth. Is that true?
So the basic chemical structure of Adderall and Ritalin, methylphenidate, is they're stimulant. They're SDRIs. They keep dopamine in the synapse longer, which can enhance pleasure if you're neurotypical. It can enhance focus and regulation if you have ADHD. But the cost is, how do you know that the doctor is monitoring carefully, especially when boys and girls grow up and go to college or go into the workforce? Because we know that ADHD doesn't stop when you hit puberty now, in how many medicine cabinets in dorms and apartments around the world of young adults are these ADHD medications lying around, and the peer says, gee, I need to stay up late all night. The amount of medications we prescribe can have huge addictive potential if they're in the wrong hands. We call that diversion. You're diverting the medications to someone who hasn't had that prescription. It's a big problem.
Well, and if you just are on TikTok all day, eventually it seems like it's going to route you toward the idea that you have any number of disorders, including a lot of young women. They have
the
Tourette's,
TikTok phenomenon has really spurred this dramatic growth in ADHD in women, partly for good reason, because it was overlooked before, but also, if you go far enough in TikTok, you'll get to the 4 or 5 item self-diagnosis checklist with no supervision, and then unscrupulously, well, how can you get stimulants mail ordered to your house with no medical supervision? That's trouble.
I want to read 2 things from Paul Tuff. Had a New York Times article which really made the rounds in your field. It was called "Have We Been Thinking About ADHD All Wrong?" And a few of his assertions or suggestions or findings, people have taken issue with, and other people have said, okay, finally here's someone saying it. But 2 things from here. From 2012 to 2022, the total number of prescriptions for stimulants to treat ADHD increased in the U.S. by 58% in 1 decade. And again, that's where you start to ask, what else is at play here? Because our biology did not change 58% over the course of 1 decade. Okay.
But the number of, excuse me, young people and older people diagnosed increased. So what's interesting about this is that for kids, over the last 3 decades, if you get diagnosed with ADHD, about 2/3 of kids get medicated. That hasn't changed. But so many more kids have gotten diagnosed, especially if you get into the preteens and teen years for boys. And that same rate is applying to a much bigger population base. So that's why the prescriptions have gone up. And that's why we have medication shortages, because the FDA is trying to regulate the amount of stimulants in the supply.
And now adults. I wanted to read that. Adults are the new driver of prescriptions, Paul Tuff reports. In 2012, Americans in their 30s were issued 5 million prescriptions for stimulants to treat ADHD. A decade later, the figure had more than tripled to 18 million. It gets to that point that you're making of adults being this new...
That's right.
I don't know if it's patient group, profit center. I'm not sure what it is considered. I don't know.
I think it's catching up with a long historical ignoring that ADHD exists in adults. So
it was there all the time.
It was there all the time, especially in adults, especially in women now, not just girls. But it's also, what is the standard for what we started this conversation out about? How far extreme in symptoms and impairments do you need to be? And I think we have medical and legal and ethical considerations to make about, are medications the be-all and end-all? Should medications only really be prescribed if you've got a program in place, cognitive behavior therapy for adults, more reward-based behavioral programs in families and schools for kids so that we're getting the best chance of getting that kid the skills or that adult the skills they need rather than just suppressing symptoms. I think this is the huge question that remains.
One more question on stimulants, and then I want to spend our last 5 minutes talking about organic treatments, I'll call them. I don't know.
Sure.
I'll call them organic behavioral treatments. I did read in that New York Times piece that the original study on Ritalin, it suggested like a year out, 14 months out, these kids were still better off, that it had alleviated some symptoms. But then when they looked at that same cohort years down the line, there actually was no appreciable difference between them and other groups. Are these stimulants effective for the duration of your life?
So this is the $64 jillion question. And this was the MTA study, the multimodal treatment study of children with ADHD. My team at Berkeley was a part of it. There were 6 centers around the U.S. and Canada. And so this was a unique study at the time, about 600 kids with a combined form of ADHD, 20% girls. So they got a lot of hyperactivity and impulsivity, a lot of inattention, and they got randomly assigned to get medicated for the next 14 months or not. And then that's crossed with whether they got intensive behavioral treatment or not. And during the active treatment period, the kids who got medicated improved the symptoms the most. The kids who got the combination of the behavioral intensive treatment, home and school, and the medication improved the most in peer relationships, academics, family interactions, social skills. That was very clear at the time as well. But what happens when those kids are no longer kids whose parents say you got to take the medication in the morning and they turn out to be teenagers? Well, I don't know what ADHD is, and it makes me feel uncreative and non-spontaneous, and I don't want to take it. People who were randomly assigned to medications and the people who were not, most of the kids who started off assigned to medications stopped taking them. Some more of the kids who weren't thought, boy, by adolescence I really need it. So it's not that the medications lose their power over time. It's just that people reverted to kind of this middle ground of about a third of adolescents and young adults continued with medication. So that's why the results washed out. I think that article was completely wrong in saying that. Now, in some cases, for stimulants and SSRIs, over the years, you may have to increase your dose and switch. It's not tolerance, it's kind of a long tolerance. But I think that was completely misstated. What do we know from Scandinavia? We know a lot from Scandinavia because their health records are incredible from the moment you're conceived to the moment you die. So in Scandinavia, for adults, they know if you have an ADHD diagnosis, and they know if you've got a prescription for a stimulant medication every 6 months. So they don't have cameras in the mirrors of the bathroom. We don't know if the people are swallowing it, but the assumption is if you're getting it prescribed, you're taking it. So comparing the periods for adults with ADHD when they got or did not get medication in a 6-month period, suicide attempt rates went down by a third, serious accidents by 40%, risk for taking a substance during that time, an illicit substance, down by close to 50%. The medications work in adulthood if they're prescribed and taken.
Wow. Okay. Now, if someone's hearing you talk and saying, I'm not against medicine, but I'd like to try the other stuff first.
Yep.
You did find in, I think it was 1997, that authoritative parenting really helped symptomatic boys.
That's right. And
what does that look like?
So it's kind of interesting. And so we did this study in our summer camps for boys. We couldn't randomly assign kids to live in homes where there's good authoritative parenting or not. We tried, but the ethical review board said we couldn't replace kids into different homes. But we had a big range of parents of both our neurotypical boys and our boys with ADHD from very authoritative. That means you love, just dedicated to your kid, but you also set very firm limits and you hold to them. You don't give in, as opposed to being overly permissive or just overly strict boot camp. And it turns out for the boys with ADHD, living in a home with parents who it's hard to do it with a boy with ADHD. You kind of give up and you give in, and it's hard to be warm when there's disruption all the time. Mm-hmm. The parents who maintained that firm yet affirming parenting style didn't have much to do with their symptoms, but it predicted a lot how well liked the boys were with their peers. In the neurotypical boys, the authoritative parenting didn't predict much of anything in terms of social competence. For the boys with ADHD, it predicted a whole lot. It's just like the British studies, the adoption studies we talked about briefly a little while ago. Even if you're not biologically related to your kid, so adoptive kids, about 5% in England, have ADHD. And the parenting, the harsh versus the more authoritative, makes a difference 15 years later in school achievement and in growth into conduct disorder.
Wow. How about screens? Seems like an easy, not easy, because then you got to keep them busy. And then if kids are prone to being wild, and again, I have twin 5.5-year-old boys. I know all about this.
Right.
Less screen time for kids, maybe less social media for adults. Do you think that'd be helpful?
I think it would. So I'm part of a study with 180 authors, not usually the case, where all of us reviewed the 27 main hypotheses about screens and social media.
I heard about this.
Their effects on mental health.
On Derek Thompson's podcast, I heard about this, yes.
That's right. And so it's a preprint now. We're seeing if it gets accepted for publication in a really good journal. And part of it is chicken and egg. Do anxiety and depression result from over-screen usage, or do they cause it? And the answer is yes.
Yeah.
And it's hard to sort out because it's hard to randomly assign kids to screens. Although there are some interesting studies where schools have abandoned screens altogether for kids, and some families have agreed to do this, and some teens have agreed to do it. And at least in the short term, the mental health improves pretty dramatically in these kids. Could we do that society-wide? I'm not sure. And social media giveth and taketh away. It's a great source of peer support. It's a great source of reducing stigma, which is a whole other agenda in my research and kind of humanistic life that I'm trying to foment around the world. But at the same time, the screens, we talked about the TikTok phenomenon for adults with ADHD, it can lead to overdiagnosis and overmedication. For cutting behavior, which is a big outcome for many kids with ADHD, especially girls, social media can provide the support, and you can confidentially disclose, not to your parents, but to other kids your age, you're cutting. They're also the world's best self-help manuals about how to cut more deeply. So screens, I think, as a society, we need to think very hard about. Some screens are good, some screen use is awful, and how to enforce policy on that. It's probably no accident that as screen use has increased, so have the mental health crisis. But to say that that's the causal factor, it's so multifaceted.
Okay. 2 more quickies. Food. You've heard of the MAHA movement, Make America Healthy Again, and some people just associate that with RFK Jr. and vaccines or something. But another element of that is let's eat better foods, more whole foods, less ultra-processed foods, stuff full of junk. And I think of God bless my mom. I love my mom so much, and she's watching this, I know. But you're eating junk in the morning, junk at lunch and night. That cannot be good for you, especially if, like you say, you're predisposed to behavioral or cognitive issues.
So diet and ADHD have had a long and checkered history. 50, 60 years ago, here in the San Francisco Bay Area, Dr. Feingold, who worked at Kaiser, said that salicylates, apples, and additives and dyes and junky food was bad for kids with ADHD. And he said if you get kids off that diet, about 80% improve. He never had a control group. That's the problem. And then when people would go into homes and actually wrap all the foods in red or green colors and sometimes change the foods or sometimes change the labels, turned out that only 5% of kids with ADHD didn't make a big difference. But over the last 10 to 20, so it's not a panacea. Changing the diet is not going to dramatically improve the kid with ADHD. But over the last couple of decades, in Europe and the United States, especially for young kids under 10, and especially with some of the artificial dyes and additives, if you can get rid of those, it's not as powerful as the behavioral treatments or as medications, but it can take away a couple of symptoms. And what I try to, in groovy Northern California, everybody talks this way. And as a scientist, I try to talk this way with understanding of what it means. We need to do holistic treatment, which means Boy, the research shows aerobic exercise helps kids with ADHD as well as adults. Better diet, not the junky foods. They're not going to help anybody. Parenting that is firm yet affirming. Radical acceptance that your kid has ADHD and radical commitment to really do something about it. Medications as needed. We used to be without, you had to be on 7 days a week at a high dose. Now you can tailor it and keep kids off during weekends, and it may catch up with their growth. You don't need to do it during periods where they don't need to concentrate as intensively. And this over and under diagnosis paradox we've been talking about this whole past almost hour, we need to be more sensible. We need to understand that it takes a good long while to diagnose ADHD carefully, and that general lifestyle and that a society that has values for kids and purpose, that's going to help. I mean, what do we really need to do for kids with ADHD? Find what they're good at, find their strengths, and let them go at it. And they may have somewhat atypical long life outcomes, but they're going to thrive.
I love to hear you say that, because think of all the feedback they get. So much of it
it's just a negative cycle. Yeah,
and they really, I mean, they're born just kids, you know,
That's
and
right.
they want love and they want validation and encouragement like everybody else. Let me say one thing to exonerate my mom. She put a square meal on the table every night for 4 kids. And so, you know, she really did that. And I don't know how she did it, because I can't seem to manage that with 2 kids. Okay, the last thing I wanted to ask you. Play, you just got to that. I notice when I take my boys out and they can run and climb and roughhouse and just be boys or whatever, that really helps too.
It does help. It's not a cure for ADHD. I mean, let's be honest. And we've run summer camps for years, day camps for kids with ADHD and neurotypical kids alongside them, and boys and girls, et cetera, et cetera. And the more play that's really play is going to help any kid's development from a young age on. But the problem with ADHD is, remember, it's not an attention deficit, it's an attention regulation. How do you switch gears from the outdoor to now I've really got to buckle down? It's something I'm not that good at doing, like learn to read or learn to do math. And that's where medication can help. And that's where a teacher who's encouraging. And that's why reward systems help. So I'm anti the panaceas, the diet that cures everybody and the play that cures everybody. But I'm all for holistic treatments, because something can work for everybody if it's got the right balance of evidence-based interventions and it's really tailored to developing that kid's strength.
This has been so incredibly helpful and nuanced, and I think that's what everybody needs right now. They need that nuance, the layers, and
that's right.
I think they're going to be logging on to the Hinshaw lab to find out more. Professor Hinshaw, thank you so much.
Thanks for the pertinent and cogent questions, and it was a delight to be on.
I don't know about you, I found this conversation fascinating, but also challenging, because that holistic approach, boy, it takes a lot of thought and resources and effort from a lot of different parties around kids and young adults. What did this make you think when it comes to the root causes of ADHD, or diagnostics, or best routes of treatment? I would love to get your thoughts in a comment below. Also, you can find more conversations like this by subscribing to All Boy. I'm on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, and Substack. The website is allboyallgood.com. I'm Chance Seals. See you next time.